Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Good, wonderful. It is a wonderful pleasure this evening to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Doug Harris. The inaugural lecture marks a very significant moment in a scholarly career. The process for obtaining this promotion takes about a year, and it involves 4 steps. First, a significant portion of one's written work is sent out to external assessors, experts in the field, at arm's length to the candidate. They can't be your friends, for a sort of arm's length neutral read of how this body of work shapes up. These assessments, along with all of one's teaching evaluations over the entire trajectory of one's career and everything else on your CV, are then reviewed by a committee comprising all the full professors already in the faculty, and those people then vote on the application. And then that entire file goes to the university's Senior Appointments Committee, which is a group of 20 or so scholars from disciplines across the campus who also have a chance to vote on the application. And finally, the entire assembled file goes to the president's office, and the university president makes the final decision, taking into account all of these levels of assessment. Doug was promoted to the rank of full professor on the 1st of July 2017, and our first order of business is to congratulate him. The moment when one achieves this final promotion is an ideal time to look back over one's scholarly achievements and to take stock, and to ask in a new way, what's next? Because really, at this point, there is truly nothing left to prove. Doug Harris completed his BA in history here at UBC. He followed that with an LLB at the University of Toronto, an LLM back here at UBC, supervised by our very own Wes Pugh, and a PhD from Osgoode Hall Law School, supervised by Douglas Hay, which he completed in 2004. He joined this faculty in 2001, was tenured and promoted to the rank of associate professor in 2007, and was named the Nemetz Chair in Legal History in 2010. Doug has published 2 books. Fish, Law and Colonialism, The Legal Capture of Salmon in British Columbia, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2001. And Landing Native Fisheries, Indian Reserves and Fishing Rights in British Columbia, was published by UBC Press in 2008. He has published more than 24 articles and chapters and given more than 150 public lectures about various aspects of his research. Doug is an award-winning researcher. On 5 separate occasions, his work has been recognized with scholarly prizes, beginning with the 2005 York University PhD Dissertation Prize. In 2013, Doug also, in a different domain, won the law school's George Curtis Memorial Award for Teaching Excellence. He's truly a beloved teacher. He is also a very, very dedicated graduate supervisor. He has supervised 12 students to the completion of their graduate projects and has served on at least as many supervisory committees, and is currently supervising, and my count might be a little bit wrong here, but I think 5 additional students are currently working on their doctoral projects with Doug. Doug has won competitive grants, he's co-authored a leading casebook, he's participated in public debate, he chairs the UBC Press Board, and he's very engaged in the community in areas that I haven't even mentioned, areas that don't have anything to do with work, if you can imagine that. And to the very best of my knowledge, Doug is the only current faculty member to have competed in the Olympics. And somehow, in all of this, Doug has made time to be an exemplary colleague and leader here in the faculty. He served a 5-year term as the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies. This is a job that 2 people took over when he stepped down from it. He has led our appointments process for several years. He is one of those colleagues who always makes time to support others. It is really an immense pleasure, and it was an immense pleasure, to be involved in Doug's promotion process because it afforded me the time to learn more about his accomplishments and to hear the many, many wonderful things that people have to say about his scholarship, his work here in the faculty, and about Doug as a person. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all very much for spending a little bit of time this evening hearing some condominium property stories. Before I get going on those stories, just an acknowledgement that we are in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Coast Salish people. And as Elder Larry Grant reminds us on the numerous occasions that he visits here, we have the house post of Chief Capilano or Kiapilano standing watch over the territory and the university just outside these windows. So Catherine mentioned my early career as a field hockey player in that introduction. And I raise that now because when I was a field hockey player, my first trip with the national team was in 1986, and we went to Pakistan. And the manager on that team, almost from the get-go, called me the professor. And at that time, I was a pretty good field hockey player, but I was a very mediocre student. There was nothing about my record that would lead anyone to suggest that I might one day be a professor. But Dennis Crook somehow knew better. So Dennis, here's to you. My other nickname on that team was a long, tall drink of water. And fortunately, that one didn't stick. A few other thank yous. First, it's an enormous privilege to be a faculty member at one of the world's outstanding public universities, the University of British Columbia. And the opportunity to be here is in large part a function of this public university, the University of Toronto, another important and awfully good public university, and York University and Osgoode Hall Law School. And so, in effect, my first thank you is the broadest, which is to all you and the rest of the Canadian public who support the post-secondary education in this country, because these public institutions are crucially important, and the work I do, I hope, is some small recognition of the public's faith in us as scholars and as teachers. My second thank you is a little closer to home. I had two extraordinary role models as I was growing up. That's my parents, Cole Harris and Muriel Harris, both of whom were university professors, both of whom showed me how to build meaningful lives through university scholarship and teaching, and in doing so to make a contribution. And my last thank you is to Candy Thompson, who there she is, my wife, who has been with me on this crazy journey since I started law school in 1990. And being an academic is, well, one has the extraordinary privilege of flexibility, but there's not an off switch. And I think Candy has put up with the lack of an off switch for a long time. Candy, thank you. So condominium property stories. What I'd like to do is to tell a series of stories about condominium property. Some of the stories are at a province-wide scale. They deal with the province of British Columbia. Some are at a city-wide scale, and my focus is the city of Vancouver. Some deal with neighborhoods. Some of the stories deal with buildings. All of them deal with people, and in a few cases with individuals. And I'm telling these stories really for two purposes. I'm telling them because I think that condominium property as a form of ownership is having an important effect on the landscapes in which we live. This form of legal architecture that structures a type of ownership is having a powerful and profound effect on our urban and, in some cases, our suburban and rural landscapes. So that's my first point. The second point that I want to tell these stories for is to suggest that this form of ownership, condominium property, is having an impact on the way in which we understand what it means to be an owner, and an owner of an interest in land in particular. Right? So it's these reasons, the impact of this form of ownership on landscapes and this impact of this form of ownership on how we understand ownership more generally, are why I think these stories are important. So before I get into the stories, first let's just set the table, because I know that not all of you are immersed in condominium or strata property. And so I say condominium or strata property. The two terms mean the same thing. In British Columbia, we happen to call what most of the rest of the world calls condominium, we call strata property. Condominium or strata property, it's the same legal form, and the characteristics of that legal form are fourfold. First, condominium or strata property creates a private interest in land. You have an individual parcel that belongs to an individual owner. The second thing that one has is an undivided share of the common property, a share that you hold with all of the other individual owners in the development. And so you can think of a condominium or a strata property building with an owner owning their individual apartment, but then all of the common property, the exterior walls, the roof, the elevator shaft, the boiler, the pool, the weight room, whatever, the common property, that is all owned together by all of the individual owners. The third feature of condominium property is a right to participate in the collective governance of that private and common property. So rules such as no smoking in your unit, no rentals or no short-term rentals, or the pool closes at 10 o'clock, or that this company is going to be our garbage contractor. And all of those decisions are made by the owners of the strata development. And then the fourth element, which is tied closely with the fact that all of the owners are holders of common property, is that all of the owners together are responsible for the maintenance of the common property. This commonly takes the form of strata fees or levies. So these are the four features of condominium property: individual ownership, a share of the common property, a right to participate in the governance of that private and common property, and an obligation to contribute to the maintenance of the common property. Okay, so my first story. Some of these stories, some of you will have heard before. Some of you won't have heard. They're new. None of you will have heard this package of stories. So what got me interested in condominium? Well, it was the teaching of property law and of looking out on the city of Vancouver and what is the prominent feature. Well, this is the downtown peninsula, or representations, photographs of the downtown peninsula on two books, one by geographer John Puntner, another by designer Lance Berlowitz, both of which feature these glass and steel and concrete structures. For a property law scholar, both of which feature strata property on the front cover. And as I looked at these buildings and thought about the teaching of property law, I thought, okay, I can't ignore this form of ownership. Right? Now, both of these scholars describe the renewal and rejuvenation of Vancouver as a model of urban redevelopment. There's a whole set of other scholars who critique what has happened in this city as unbridled gentrification, of the construction of a city as a playground for the elites. We've heard a lot of that recently, and it seems to become particularly prominent as property values soar. My argument in an early paper was that whether one sees Vancouver as a poster city for urban redevelopment on the continent, or as a city that's increasingly inaccessible to its citizens, that condominium was an important part of that story. We couldn't ignore the legal architecture. And British Columbia is the first jurisdiction in Canada to introduce a statutory form of condominium property. And it occurs, and I promise you there'll be mostly photographs and maps and not much text. But given that I am a legal scholar, here's the statute that introduces in 1966 strata title. Now, over the years, it's been strata titles. For a few years, it was condominium property, and now it's strata property. But you'll see in section 3, underlined is the important section. With the deposit of a strata plan, with the deposit of a document at the Land Title Office, one can create strata lots. And those strata lots are parcels of land that can be transferred, disposed of, dealt with as any other parcel of land. So this was the statute that created the possibility of strata property in this province. Now, what's a strata plan? Well, here is a sheet from a strata plan of one of those shiny glass towers near the Olympic Village. What a strata plan does is it, in schematic form, outlines the private property interests. And so there's a vertical cross-section here, and this building is 22 stories high, so you only have the top 10 stories. Here is a horizontal cross-section of the 12th floor showing the private interests. Now, I know it's hard to see from a distance, but each of those boxes around the perimeter is an individual strata lot, an apartment, and in the interior are the stairwells, the elevators, the common property. So this is the document that creates a strata lot, which creates the strata development. Now, not all strata developments are shiny towers of multiple stories. This was the very first strata plan in British Columbia. It was built in 1970. The architect, I don't think any of you will ever guess, although Frances Beulah in her digging discovered that it was Arthur Erickson. Now, I don't think anyone will think of this one as one of his finest, sort of a West Coast blah. But interesting that the province's prominent modernist architect was involved in this quintessential modernist legal architecture, the Strata Property. This was in Port Moody. Let me zoom back out now to the city of Vancouver. And what has happened in the 51 years since this form of ownership was created? That form of ownership has largely colonized the city. It has come to dominate all of the neighborhoods in the city that are zoned something other than single-family residential. And so this map, each of those dots is a strata plan. This map is only up to 2010. As of 2010, there were 4,200 strata buildings in Vancouver, creating nearly 100,000 strata lots. 100,000 strata lots. This was in 2010. And this is in a city of just over 600,000 people. This is just the city of Vancouver property. So 100,000. 37% of owner-occupiers lived within strata. And that was as of 2006. So we're probably rapidly approaching 50% of owner-occupiers living within strata. It's become the dominant form of ownership in the city. And certainly when I teach students and they're thinking about the possibility of owning property, what they're thinking about is not the single-family lot anymore, but at least in the city of Vancouver, the strata lot. Now, this map will have changed quite a bit in the last 6 or 7 years. You can see on the right side of the map a small cluster right at the border with Burnaby. Along the SkyTrain, that's one of the SkyTrain stops along the SkyTrain lines. There will be more along Granville, along Oak, along Cambie. And you have driven those roads, you'll know that it's filling in with strata property. Strata property is crucially important. Now, as a legal scholar, it's hard for me to measure why or exactly how it's important. But I think revealing its extent and describing this phenomenon is an important first step. Now, strata property not only serves as the architecture of ownership for glass towers, but it also serves as the architecture of ownership for suburban subdivisions. And this is what's called a bare land strata. In this bare land strata, instead of describing the private space in 3 dimensions, the private space is simply described in 2 dimensions. So you can you can subdivide a parcel of land just like you might in a regular subdivision, although you do it within condominium property. And so this is in North Surrey, and you can see Highway 1 there on the top right, and in the center, there are 2 points of access into what is a gated community, with each of those houses occupying an individual strata lot, the roads being the common property. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about bare land strata because this is a story I'm still in the process of telling, and so you'll get a little more of the detail. The first bare land strata development was on Shuswap Lake. Here it is. It was built in 1975. You can see the timeline on the top. And this, I apologize for the watermark, but this was the strata plan that created that bare land strata subdivision. You can see the road, the common property in the middle, and then lots attaching to the road on either side, and it's Shuswap Lake on the right. And now have a look at that zigzag road through the middle, and then have a look at this next image, which shows, with the wonders of Google Earth, that same development from a few years ago. You can see the road, the public road on the top, the highway, the internal common property road zigzagging through, and the lots running down. So a common use of the bare land strata was in these lakeside or recreation type properties. Another common early use was this. This is in the Upper Fraser Valley. It is a manufactured home park or a trailer park. Again, each of the pads marked off as a private interest in land, the roads being common property. This is an interesting one from a few years later. This is in Peachland, and you can see the cul-de-sac, and then right at the end of the cul-de-sac there's a bit of black asphalt that leads off. And so what the developer has been able to do here is to use bare land strata to create a common property road, that's the black asphalt, and then two lots, one at the front and one at the back. And what bare land strata does is allow for road access to that lot in the back. Without bare land strata, you couldn't have that second house in here. And so bare land strata is being used in a number of different ways. Here is, again, the first. In 1976, there's almost 20 bare land strata. Developers are quick to catch on. Developers, financiers, and purchasers are quick to catch on to bare land strata. Now, I'm going to let this series of slides run for a minute. The black dots are the new strata developments that are registered every year, and the red dots will accumulate over time. So we'll see if this works. The beginnings of a concentration of strata property development in the Okanagan, in the Fraser Valley, and on Vancouver Island. And I just pause here in this slide from 1994, and you'll see that the focus of development is actually beginning to shift to Vancouver Island. This bare land strata as a form of subdivision is being used increasingly on Vancouver Island. Let me keep running now. 1995, again, concentration on southern Vancouver Island. I should just say that all of these maps have been drawn by the remarkable cartographer in the Department of Geography, Eric Leinberger. These maps help me see things that I wouldn't see without them. They also help me explain things that I wouldn't be able to explain without them. Now here we stopped in 2008. This is the peak of bare land strata subdivision in this province. There's 120 developments in 2008, and we'll just keep going to the end of the run. And what we left with at the end is a map of all of the bare land strata subdivisions in British Columbia. Now, because law professors don't actually deal with numbers and statistics. Well, this isn't really statistics, it's just numbers all that often. I'm going to show you a slide with numbers. As of the end of 2016, there were nearly 2,500 bare land strata subdivisions, creating 43,639 individual strata lots. So these maps and these numbers took an extraordinary amount of time and the assistance of a number of student researchers searching in the Land Title Office and distinguishing between bare land strata and building strata. And I'm still trying to figure out how to represent and explain what's going on here, but let me show you a few other representations. Here's a map of the new bare land strata that are introduced into the province every year, and you can see that there was a peak in 1994, and then a drop off, and then another peak in 2008, and then a dramatic drop off and a slight rebound in the last couple of years. Here's another representation, and this shows how much of a story this is on Vancouver Island. That almost half of these 2,400 bare land strata subdivisions are on Vancouver Island. The next most developed area is in the Kamloops Land Title District, which is the Okanagan, and then New Westminster, which is the Fraser Valley. Vancouver is Vancouver and Whistler. And you can see that with building strata, the story was really Vancouver. With Bearland strata or Bearland condominium, the story is not the big cities. It's in the suburbs and outside of the urban core. Here's another map showing the Lower Mainland, and you can see clusters around Chilliwack, around Abbotsford, but really the city of Vancouver is almost empty. And this makes sense, right? These are developments that spread out rather than going up. Here is zoom in on the Okanagan. Scale's a little bit tough to see from a distance, I realize, but here's the big story, and it's southern Vancouver Island, and in particular, the suburbs of Colwood and Langford, just outside Victoria, where there's hundreds of these with these Bearland strata subdivisions. Now let me tell you a couple of particular stories about them, and they're stories as a common law scholar is wont to do that come out of cases. The first one involves a dispute on Salt Spring Island. Some of you who are familiar with Salt Spring Island will know Musgrave Harbour. Here is the Bearland strata plan that created the development Musgrave Harbour. And what this plan reveals is one of the reasons for why you might want to use this legal structure to subdivide. So what's going on here, there's a number of small strata lots that you can see on that point beside the harbor. And then this is my pointer showing up on the screen there. Yeah, so this big strata lot here, this is strata lot 23, and then 22 are clustered around here. So what's going on here is that the developer is taking advantage of what's called lot size averaging. So if the regional district says that lots need to be a minimum of 5 acres or 10 acres or 1 acre, with lot size averaging, you can take the total area of the property and divide that total area by the number of lots, in this case 22. And if that average lot size is at or larger than the minimum lot size, then you're okay. So this developer has created one huge lot to take advantage of lot size averaging that then allows it to cluster development around this valuable amenity, the ocean. And here, zooming in on that cluster of developments, of lots, and again with the Bearland strata, you can see the individual lots. The common property here is an access to a common beach. Here's a road going down to the marina, and then let me show you again. So, through the wonders of Google Earth, here is the image. And another interesting part of this image is this marina, which they would be operating under a provincial foreshore lease, and it effectively blocks access to what would be public water and a public beach, but in effect makes it private. So one of the reasons why you might want to use a Bearland strata is to take advantage of lot size averaging. Another reason we can see in this example, this is the largest single Bearland strata lot in British Columbia. It's 641 units. It's, if anybody's a golfer, it's the Arbutus Ridge Golf Course on southern Vancouver Island, just across the strait from Salt Spring Island. It's actually a former industrial site, and there would be a really interesting story to be told about the connections between False Creek and their rejuvenation or redevelopment of False Creek, a former industrial site, with this. And you can see the remnant of the earlier industry in these petroleum tanks up above the development. This is from the water, looking at that. So these are houses with lovely ocean views. Arbutus Ridge describes itself as Canada's first gated community for active adults. And if you look in the bylaws, the rules provide that in any of these living structures, in any of these houses, there may only be 2 permanent residents, one of whom must be at least 50 years or older. There's other bylaws that provide that there will be no rentals for shorter than 1 month or longer than 6 months. So it's a rental period that's allowed between 1 and 6 months, which would fit a snowbird. Like, right, somebody's heading south for the winter and their house is open for 5 months. They could rent it out. So it's not longer, not shorter, but you're allowed a third adult or a fourth adult in this development if that adult is a caregiver. So this is another reason why one might want to use bare land strata, which is it allows one to drape a development with a set of bylaws. A set of bylaws that in this case construct the possibility of what's being described as an active adult retirement community. So bare land strata or strata generally allows one, again, this comes back to this feature of collective governance, that allows one to govern collectively. It also, and this is a crucial issue for property law, it also allows the owners to maintain common amenities like this boat launch. The requirement that you contribute to a common amenity like a boat launch is what's called a positive covenant, an obligation to make a payment. And positive covenants outside of strata don't run with the land. They can't bind future owners. So for all of these reasons, lot size averaging, the capacity to govern and create a particular type of environment, and the capacity to levy for common amenities are some of the reasons why people are using bare land strata. So to come back to my big picture, bare land strata and building strata in cities or in suburbs or in resort towns or recreational communities are an important part of the places that we're constructing. Right? We can't ignore this form of ownership, this form of ownership that creates communities, but communities of owners. All right, now let's move into some of the more detailed stories that I think help us to understand what's happening with our idea of ownership. And the first involves a conflict that occurred in this townhouse condominium development in Ontario. I'm leaving British Columbia briefly. Don't worry, I'll get back to British Columbia in a moment. In this townhouse of 37 units, there was an owner, Natalie Korolek. And Natalie Korolek was, I think, what is safe to say, a neighbor from hell. She had a big dog that she would let run at neighbors' children until they were within inches of the nose and then stop the leash from running out. She would climb up onto people's balconies and peer into their apartments at night. She would yell racist and homophobic slurs at her neighbors. She poisoned plants. She turned up the music loud and made life unbearable for the other residents in this complex. And in this decision in 2010, the Ontario High Court made an order that Ms. Korolek would be evicted from the development and forced to sell her unit. The court made an eviction and forced sale. They called this case a perfect storm with a recalcitrant owner with extreme behavior who showed no signs of improving despite hundreds of letters, thousands of dollars of fines, all of which were unpaid. In British Columbia, a similar series of events was unfolding in this development. This involved a mother and a son, the Jordisons. Jordisons, the behavior may not have been quite as extreme as Ms. Korolek's, but they held loud parties, played music loud, yelled and screamed at each other, had an enormously fractious relationship, yelled at other members within the development. Geordie Jordison, the son, was a big fellow. He would stand and block the elevator and not let other people pass. There were threats and intimidation. And in this case, as in Ontario, the BC Supreme Court made an order that the Jordisons had to leave and they had to sell. Now, in British Columbia, the jurisdiction or the capacity to make that order is found in the Strata Property Act, right, which was the Strata Titles Act. It's now the Strata Property Act. And that act allows a court to make an order to enforce the act, right, to make an order requiring an owner to do something, to follow the act or the bylaws, to stop doing something, or to make an order in support of either that order to do something or to stop doing something. And the BC Court of Appeal said, well, in the first instance, you can't make an order under C, you can't make an eviction and forced sale order under C without having first made an order either to stop doing something or to do something. And so the BC Court of Appeal overturned that eviction and forced sale. The behavior continued. The parties ended up back in court. The BC Supreme Court made the same order, eviction and sale, and this time the BC Court of Appeal upheld that decision. So now we have orders for eviction and forced sale. And if we stop and think about it for a moment, this is a remarkable development. Imagine a city block with 20 owners, one of whom is as vindictive and destructive of community as Ms. Korolek or the Jordisons. But no court is going to give an order forcing the sale of that individual house and the eviction of the owner. You might be able to we can call the police. You might be able to get a remedy in the tort of nuisance, but you're not going to get an eviction or an order for eviction and forced sale. What the courts are doing is saying that in strata property, there's now a minimum threshold of behavior that one must meet in order to remain an owner. The minimum threshold, at some point, your behavior becomes too irresponsible, too destructive, and you no longer are entitled to your status as owner. You're forced to sell, and you are evicted. And now what this is doing is diminishing the property interests, the security of those who are subject to these eviction and forced sale orders. Their property is less secure, but it's strengthening the property interest of everybody else. Everybody else in that development has access to a remedy, eviction and forced sale, that those of us who live outside strata property or condominium don't have. And so what's happening with these eviction and forced sales is a redistribution of ownership. And when I began looking at these cases, and there were 10 of them when I wrote the article, there's now 11 of them in Ontario and BC, 11 circumstances, 11 cases where individuals are ordered to sell and vacate their property. When I began looking at them, I thought, well, this makes sense. Ownership is about rights. It's also about responsibilities. At some point, if you fail to meet your responsibilities, you forfeit your right to ownership. That seems reasonable. But then I began to notice passing references to mental illness. In the majority of these cases, one of the contributing factors to the behavior is a mental illness. In some cases, it's paranoid schizophrenia that leads to behavior that may be directly threatening to neighbors. In other cases, it involves hoarding, where there's no direct threat, but the accumulation of garbage in a unit creates a significant fire hazard or a flooding hazard or pests or smells. In all these cases, or in the majority of cases anyway, mental illness is involved. And that gave me pause. Because what's happening here is that the courts are restructuring what it means to be an owner, increasing the property rights of some, diminishing the property rights of others. And those whose property rights are being diminished, who are subject to these eviction and forced sale orders, are in most cases suffering from some form of mental illness that makes living in close proximity with other people more difficult. Now, this is a significant change in what it means to be an owner, and maybe a problematic one. What it's a function of is a massive increase in the density of ownership. Our idea of ownership emerged in a context where owners were spread out over a horizontal plane across the surface of the earth. But now we've created this property interest, strata property or condominium property, that stacks owners in a vertical column that may be 60 stories high. We're living cheek by jowl as owners in a way that we haven't ever done before. And the courts are responding to this spatial reorganization of owners by restructuring what it means to be an owner. And so the question that I think these cases raise is this appropriate restructuring of ownership in this context? Okay, I know I'm running out of time and I still have 2 more stories to tell. The next story involves this development. This is a development at 12th and Oak. It's called 12 Oaks, right across from Vancouver General Hospital. This is the first building to have gone through a strata property termination or dissolution proceeding under the new rules. So until 2016, the presumption was that all of the owners in a strata development needed to agree in order to terminate that development. The presumption was that you needed unanimous consent in order to terminate the development. Well, as of 2016, the amendment was passed in 2015, but it came into force in 2016. As of 2016, 80% of owners may now force the termination or dissolution of strata property. So the presumption now is 80%. The presumption used to be unanimous consent. Now, there was a possibility, even with the presumption being unanimous consent, that a court might order a dissolution even when there wasn't unanimous consent, but the presumption was. Now the presumption is 80%. And even if there is an 80% vote, the strata corporation needs to go to court to have that order confirmed. Now, what's happening here is that with this switch from unanimous consent to 80%, the legislature has made it easier to terminate or dissolve strata property. And what happens when you dissolve strata property is you terminate the individual strata lots. Everybody now becomes a co-owner of the whole. The individual strata lots are gone. The strata corporation is wound up, and everybody becomes a co-owner of the whole. And the usual motivation for this is that there's more value in a collective sale than in an individual sale. And in the case of 12 Oaks, this was true. Right? The developer who bought this lot paid the owners twice what their assessment was. Right? Their individual assessed lots were worth $600,000. Well, they walked away with nearly $1.2 million for their strata lot. So the motivation in this context is usually that the collective sale brings the owners more. But what this 80% rule also does is allow for a private taking of property. Because 80% can force the termination of all of the interests, including the 20 who oppose. It's a form of private taking. Now, everybody benefits. Everybody gets the developer's premium from the sale, from the collective sale. But what about the owner who says, I don't want that developer's premium. This is my home. I want to stay. I hold the largest interest in property that the common law recognizes a freehold interest. I understood it was as strong as any other freehold interest. I understood it was strong as that individual lot on a city block. Imagine all of those consolidations of property that are happening along Oak and Granville. In none of those circumstances can the other 19 who want to sell for the developer's premium force that one who doesn't to sell. But now within strata property, you can. Now the question is this taking or this forced sale appropriate? And in order to answer that question, we need to ask another question, which is, well, what are we protecting property for? What are we doing here? Are we protecting the investment value? Because if so, an 80% rule makes a whole lot of sense. Or are we protecting something else like home? And if we're protecting home, then a unanimity rule makes sense. Right? So an important shift has gone on in this balance of residential property interests between places to create homes and places of investment. And the shift here in this case has been towards investment. Okay, last story. Last story. It involves this. This is the story that I have developed the least. But I think it may be the most important story of the whole bunch. But I'm not quite sure why yet, so this is where I need your help. And maybe you can tell me in the questions. It won't be a question period, it'll be a help Doug period. This is Carroll Station. This is a development that was built in 1996, 97. And Carroll Station is at the corner of Cordova and Carroll Street. And here, another of Eric Lineberger's terrific maps. You can see it there. It's right on this boundary between Gastown, Water Street, and the shops for tourists and the nice restaurants and the funky clothing stores, and the downtown east side. And it was built by the same developer who built the Van Horn right across the street. And the Van Horn is in the same block as the Woodward's building. Now, when this development went ahead in 1995, the Van Horn and Carroll Station in 1996, there was an awful lot of community opposition. The Downtown East Side Residents Association was mad that this development was going in, and they fought hard to prevent it, unsuccessfully. But it galvanized some of the support for the Woodward's building, and the confrontation over the development of Carroll Station was led in part to the squat around Woodward's and eventually the city's purchasing of the Woodward's land and the mix of market and social housing that goes in Woodward's. But this development was on the forefront of these debates between the future of the Downtown East Side. Was the Downtown East Side going to be a space where the downtown would stretch out into and condominium and office buildings would be built, or was it going to be a space where traditionally marginalized communities could continue to build and operate as community? This development included commercial units on the ground floor and residential units on the top 5 floors. It looks like it's taller, but the top 3 floors are lofts, are 2 stories. Now, the OmniCare Pharmacy occupied and occupies one of the commercial lots. And this is the entrance to the OmniCare Pharmacy, just to the right of that fire hydrant, that door. You can't quite see it, but it says OmniCare Pharmacy. And next door to it, just to the east, is the entrance to Carroll Station residential apartments that are up above. Now, the OmniCare Pharmacy is open from 7 a.m. 365 days a year. It's open every day of the year from 7 a.m. on weekdays until 5 p.m. and on weekends and holidays until 12 p.m. It's a dispensing pharmacy. All it sells are prescription drugs. There's no toothpaste, there's no shampoo, there are no cosmetics. It's just a dispensing pharmacy. And its customers are from the Downtown East Side. And its customers are methadone users who use methadone as a way to control an addiction. And the customers have a range of other medical needs. But often at 7 a.m. in the morning, there's a lineup in front of people waiting to get their prescription. And on some nights, there are people sleeping outside in front. And I walked by, as I've done now fairly frequently, as I think about this place and what's going on here. One day I saw a fellow inside the pharmacy sleeping on the floor with his head on the suitcase while the pharmacists behind the counter were working. Well, the residents upstairs took exception to this behavior on the street. They complained of the noise, of the threats, of the garbage, of people sleeping on the sidewalk, of the human feces and the mess that was left. And the Strata Corporation, that was managed largely by residents, tried to remove the pharmacy. And it did so with a number of bylaws that tried to reduce opening hours that made the pharmacy responsible for the behavior of its customers and other guests. The pharmacy won this case, and I'll tell you briefly on the technical grounds that the pharmacy was facing fines of tens of thousands of dollars for these breaches of bylaws that had been levied against it. And the pharmacy took the Strata Corporation to court and won on the grounds that the bylaws had been inappropriately passed, that to change a bylaw you need the agreement of 75% of the owners, and there had been 75%, but when a strata is mixed use, commercial and residential, you need the approval of 75% of the commercial users and 75% of the residential users, and there had been no separate vote. The commercial vote hadn't ever been tallied, and so the court threw out the fines and overturned the bylaws. That's the technical story, but what's interesting here is that what's happening in this conflict is that the battle for the downtown east side, which has been fought out in city halls and community centers about whether a condominium should go in or social housing, whether this amenity or that social service should go in, it's all happened in the public sphere. Here, that same battle over the future of the downtown east side is happening within condominium. It's happening within this private sphere of governance between strata lot owners. One happens to be the pharmacy owner, one happens to be the residents. But what's happening is the battle for the future of the downtown east side, which is again playing out in numerous and raucous city hall meetings and other venues, has at least in part shifted to this private realm of governance. And it's shifting, not entirely, of course, but at least in part to this private realm of governance, because we've created this form of ownership that has created in the city of Vancouver not just 4,000 strata buildings, but 4,000 locations for private governance. There's now 4,000 private governance structures that are making decisions, or at least involved in resolving conflict over things like whether this pharmacy, which is catering to a clientele that serves a very different clientele than the residents in the upstairs units want to interact with, it's being heard within strata. So look, let me stop there with one final point, because I've gone a little longer than I thought. But all of these stories and all of this pressure that's being put on landscapes and on our idea of ownership is, I think, in part a function of this embedding of private ownership in community. What strata does, or what condominium does, is it takes a private interest in land and it embeds that private interest indelibly within community. That private interest doesn't exist except packaged with co-ownership and collective governance. Of course, all private property is embedded in community, but maybe quite not in the same way in which it is with strata. In strata, private interests are embedded in a community, but a community of owners, not a community of citizens, not a community of the public, a community of owners. And that, I think, that embeddedness creates both opportunities and dangers. And I hope, at least in some of this work, I'm alerting us to both those opportunities and dangers. Okay, thank you all for being so patient.